Let me take you back, not to some glamorous moment of victory or some grand spotlight scene, but to a simple classroom in the back of a modest school building. It smelled faintly of old books and pencil shavings. The walls were lined with faded posters trying their best to be motivational, though most of us hardly noticed them anymore. I sat in the third row from the front, second seat by the window, my usual spot. The seat that somehow became mine, not because I liked it, but because no one else ever took it. I wasn't the smartest kid in that room, not by a long shot. There was Kevin, who could solve algebraic equations like they were riddles he was born to answer. There was Sarah, who read Shakespeare and explained it like she'd written it herself. There was even Jacob, who never took notes but always knew the answers. And then there was me staring at the same geometry question for 15 minutes, erasing the same wrong answer over and over. Sometimes I felt like a fraud sitting there, like I was pretending to be a student while everyone else actually was one. I wasn't lazy. I just needed more time. But no one tells you that needing time is okay, especially when you grow up in a world where fast is applauded. Fast thinkers, fast readers, fast risers. Everyone loves a prodigy. Everyone loves someone who just gets it. I didn't just get it. I had to fight for it. There was this one evening I remember vividly. I had come home from school drained. My math teacher had handed back our tests. I'd gotten a 63. Everyone around me seemed to score in the 80s or 90s. I could feel my heart sinking before I even turned the paper over to see the number. I knew it had gone badly. It felt like failure. That night, I sat in my room, textbook open, calculator blinking in the dim light of my desk lamp. I looked at the clock, 5:58 p.m. The little voice that I had trained over months whispered to me, "At 6 o'clock, we begin." It didn't matter that I didn't feel like it. It didn't matter that I was tired. It didn't even matter that the day had been a complete wash. What mattered was the schedule. At 6 p.m., I was a student. Most people wait for motivation to strike before they act, but I had learned something vital. Discipline beats desire every single time. I was slow, but I was steady. I was confused, but I was committed. I felt behind, but I kept showing up. And something strange started happening over time. While others waited for the right mood to study, I was already 20 minutes in. While others refreshed their social feeds, I refreshed my mind with formulas and practice questions. Not because I loved math, I didn't, but because I loved what discipline was doing to me. It was making me strong. I want to tell you this because maybe you're like me. Maybe you look around and feel like you're always behind. Maybe people say you're not naturally gifted, and part of you has started to believe them. But let me remind you, success isn't about being fast. It's about not stopping. You don't need to be the brightest star to shine. You just need to keep burning. One weekend I remember staying home while my friends went to a movie. They begged me to come. I wanted to say yes. I really did. But I looked at my desk, at the problem sets waiting for me, at the messy notes I had promised to rewrite, and I made a decision. "I'll catch you next time," I said. And they laughed. "Come on, just skip one night." But I knew better. It wasn't just one night. It was a brick in the wall I was building. Every scheduled hour, every 6 p.m. study session, it was a vote for the person I wanted to become. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to change my life. I used to think people were born with greatness. Now I know. Greatness is born out of repetition. While the world scrolled, I studied. While others said later, I said now. While doubt knocked, I held the door shut with a routine. I made my time sacred. I made my struggle worth something. And slowly, painfully, inch by inch, started getting better. One night, I solved a problem on the first try. Just one. But it felt like magic. Not because it was easy, but because for the first time, I didn't feel dumb. I felt capable. I closed my book and stared out the window. The streetlights outside glowed amber. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. The world went on, but inside my room, I celebrated. Because it wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about becoming someone who doesn't give up. I want you to remember something. Everyone talks about passion, about talent, about IQ and raw ability, but no one talks enough about quiet persistence, about choosing to show up when no one's watching, about making 6 p.m. sacred even when the world gives you every excuse not to. You don't need to be fast. You just need to keep going, and if you do that every day, one block at a time, you'll build something unshakable. I wasn't the smartest in the room, but I knew how to show up. While many classmates seemed born with talent, I had to build mine piece by piece, and my training ground wasn't grand or glamorous. It was a small, underlit campus library, open until late, full of dusty shelves and silence. No applause, no audience, just me, my textbooks, and a single desk lamp. After class, every day at exactly 6 p.m., I walked in, same backpack, same chair, same quiet corner. I treated that hour like a ritual, like an appointment with my future self. Because I learned early on, time doesn't wait for you. You either meet it, or it passes you by. Some nights, I fought through math problems that should have been easy but weren't, staring at equations, erasing answers again and again, my mind cloudy with frustration. Other nights, reading assignments took me double the time that others needed. I'd rewrite and reread sentences until the meaning finally clicked, and my eyes pricked with slow realization. There were no breakthroughs, just slow progress, invisible progress. But every minute I sat down and tried, every repetition, every apology I refused to make to my doubts was another brick in my foundation. While others scrolled endlessly, chasing quick dopamine hits, I turned scrolls into problem sets. I turned procrastination into purpose. Most people don't talk about that part, the invisible part, the part where no results show yet, where you still doubt yourself, but you refuse to quit. That's where character is forged. That's where ordinary people become unstoppable. I remember one morning, weeks into the routine, waking up to discover I'd solved a problem on the first attempts, something that would have taken me hours before. It wasn't because I was suddenly brilliant. It was because I had become someone who persevered long enough to see progress. That year, I didn't top the class. I didn't win awards. People didn't notice my effort. But something happened behind the scenes. I became consistent. I became stronger. I became someone who didn't stop, not because the work was easy, but because I made time sacred. At exactly 6 p.m. every day, I chose progress over comfort. I didn't wait for motivation. I leaned into confusion and frustration. I didn't care how long it took. I cared that I didn't stop. There were nights when tears came, when doubt nearly won, when I texted friends and they invited me to scroll or laugh. I said no, not because I was disciplined, because I was deliberate. I knew what it meant to betray a schedule. I knew the weight of failing myself on the final. Month before finals, I met a breakthrough. I scored among the top in my class in math, not because I was gifted, but because I showed up. Again and again. So here's what I hope you hear. Success isn't about being fast. It's about not stopping. While the world was scrolling, I was solving. While others said, I'll do it later, I said, it's 6 o'clock, let's go. Each hour I protected built more than knowledge, it built belief. Today's results didn't come from yesterday's genius, but from the thousands of small decisions to overcome, again and again. Let me tell you about 4:30 a.m., not because it sounds impressive, not because it's glamorous, but because it was quiet. You see, while the world was asleep, dreaming, scrolling, snoring, drifting, I was sitting up in bed, pulling the covers off, rubbing my eyes, and whispering to myself, let's go. It was dark. My room was cold. My body didn't want to move. My mind screamed for another hour of sleep, but I had a secret weapon. I wasn't trying to be better than anyone else. I was trying to be better than yesterday. Because yesterday, I almost quit. Yesterday, I almost gave in to the thought that maybe I'm not meant for this. Maybe this whole thing, the dream, the goal, the version of me I saw in my head, maybe it wasn't real. But 4:30 a.m. doesn't lie. At 4:30, there's no audience, no applause, no Instagram stories, no grind set, HASHTAGS. Just you and the choice. And day after day, I kept choosing. I remember this one morning. It was winter, the kind of cold that bites your bones. I'd made a little corner in my room, my study sanctuary. It had nothing fancy, just a desk, a lamp, a chair with a towel thrown over it to make it a bit less uncomfortable. The lamp flickered when I turned it on that day, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because even the light was tired. I sat down, opened my math workbook, and just stared at the page. Problem 7C. I still remember it, because it broke me. I read the question once, twice, 3 times. I couldn't make sense of it. The letters swam. The numbers mocked me. My pencil hovered, then dropped. And that was when the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears. The kind you wipe away with your sleeve because no one else is watching, because this wasn't a scene in a movie. This was real life, and I was losing now. Most people think discipline means always feeling strong, but I'll tell you the truth. Discipline is sometimes just not getting up from the chair, even when you're crying, even when you feel like a failure, even when you're convinced everyone else is miles ahead of you. That morning, I didn't solve problem 7C, but I didn't leave the desk either. I sat there for an hour, just sat. I let the pain soak in. I didn't distract myself. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't open YouTube or play background music. I let the struggle breathe, and in that silence, I learned something that would change everything. You don't have to win today. You just have to stay, you see. There are two kinds of effort in life. There's motivated effort, the kind where you're inspired, excited, full of hope, driven by a podcast or a video or a sunrise. And then there's empty effort, the kind where your heart's not in it, where every second feels like an hour, where you're just going through the motions, half believing in yourself. But here's the secret. Empty effort still counts. In fact, sometimes it counts more, because the person who only works when they feel good is already defeated. But the person who works even when they don't, they're building something deep inside, a quiet kind of strength that no one can take away. I didn't become smart overnight. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly understand everything. But little by little, I stopped being afraid of the hard problems. I stopped seeing failure as proof that I wasn't enough, and I started seeing it as part of the process. There was this one night, weeks after the 7C breakdown, when I sat down, saw a page full of problems, and smiled, because I knew I wouldn't get them all right, but I also knew I wouldn't stop trying. That was the win. That was the quiet victory no one celebrated. No likes, no claps, just me. Growing, my friends used to joke about how boring I was becoming. They'd say, "Bro, live a little. Why are you always studying? You can't even hang out on weekends anymore." And I'd smile, not because I didn't care. Trust me, it hurt to feel left out, but because I knew they didn't understand. They saw sacrifice, I saw investment, they saw wasted time, I saw planted seeds, they saw discipline as a cage, I saw it as a doorway. I didn't say much in those moments, but inside, I made a promise to myself. One day, they'll see. Not because I want to prove them wrong, but because I want to prove myself right. There's a quote I kept taped to the corner of my desk. It was messy, written in Sharpie on a torn piece of notebook paper. It said, "Slow progress is still progress." And on the hardest days, the 7C days, the tearful mornings, the nights when everything felt pointless, that quote kept me going, because I wasn't chasing fast, I was chasing forward. You know, people love talking about the destination. Graduation day, job offers, celebrations, accomplishments, but no one talks about the hallway, that in-between space, where it's lonely, where it's dark, where you wonder if the doors will ever open. But that's where you become who you're meant to be, in the hallway. I'm not sure where you are right now. Maybe you're staring at your own version of problem 7C. Maybe your lamp is flickering, your room is cold, your heart is tired. But hear me when I say this. You don't have to be the fastest. You don't have to be the smartest. You don't have to feel strong every day. You just have to stay in the chair, because the chair is where it happens, where the confusion becomes clarity, where the struggle becomes strength, where you quietly, slowly, become the person you always hoped you could be. And one day, not too far from now, someone will ask you, "How did you do it?" And you'll smile. You won't talk about magic formulas or secret talents. You'll say, "There was this one problem I couldn't solve, but I kept showing up, every single morning, even when it hurt." And they'll look at you like you're made of something different, but you'll know the truth. You're not different. You're just disciplined. And discipline, that changes everything. Let me tell you about one of the hardest weeks of my life. It was my final year of high school. Exams were coming. Pressure was mounting. I'd just gotten my scores back from a mock test, and they were brutal. Lower than I expected, lower than I needed, and far lower than the voices in my head could forgive. I remember the way my stomach dropped when I saw those numbers. I remember walking home under the weight of those marks, thinking, maybe I'm just not good enough. I remember how every step felt like dragging my feet through quicksand. You see, that's what failure does. It doesn't just hit your grades, it hits your identity. It whispers cruel stories in your ear. You're not smart. You're not capable. You're wasting your time. And if you're not careful, you start to believe those stories. But that night, the night after I saw my scores, I still sat down at 6:00 p.m. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. My mind kept drifting back to those numbers, kept replaying the disappointment, the embarrassment. But I opened the books anyway, not because I felt confident, but because I made a promise. Because discipline is louder than doubt. I didn't finish much that night. I was slower than usual. My focus was shattered. But I showed up, and showing up, especially when it's hardest, is what makes the difference. It's what builds the resilience no test score can measure. A few days later, I walked past a group of classmates at lunch. They were talking about the same mock test, laughing, joking about how everyone bombed it. One of them said, "Honestly, what's the point? None of this matters." And maybe, for them, it didn't. But for me, it mattered. Because it wasn't just about grades. It was about proving something to myself, that I could keep going even when the world told me to stop. I went home that day and studied again at 6:00, even though the jokes of my classmates echoed in my mind. Even though part of me wanted to give up and blend in. Even though doubt sat heavy in my chest like a stone. I still studied. Because here's the truth that most people don't want to hear. The difference between those who move forward and those who stay stuck isn't talent. It's tolerance. Can you tolerate being uncomfortable? Can you tolerate failing without giving up? Can you tolerate the silence of progress when nobody claps, nobody sees, and nobody believes in you but you? That week turned into a month. I didn't improve overnight, but slowly, gradually, I started to understand things that once confused me. Concepts that made no sense before began to click. I started asking questions in class. I stayed after to go over topics with the teacher. I rewrote my notes. I redid old homework assignments. I watched YouTube videos at 1.5x speed to squeeze in extra revision. And each time I sat down at 6 p.m., I reinforced the message. I am not a quitter. It didn't matter how behind I felt. It didn't matter how many others were ahead. I was running my own race. One evening, my younger cousin was visiting our house. He walked past my room at exactly 6:01 and saw me hunched over a textbook. He said, "Why do you always study at the same time?" I smiled. "Because I'm not always motivated. So I need a system." He looked confused. "But what if you're tired?" "I study tired." "What if you don't want to?" "I study anyway." That's when I realized something powerful. The moment you stop making decisions based on how you feel and start making them based on who you want to become, everything changes. Because the future isn't built on feelings. It's built on follow-through. There were nights I studied with a headache. Nights I felt like crying because the pressure was too much. Nights I failed practice papers and wanted to scream, but I kept going. Because every night I sat down at that desk, I was chiseling away at something bigger than grades. I was building a version of myself I could respect. Someone who showed up. Someone who tried. Someone who didn't run from the hard things. I learned to forgive myself on the bad days, but I never gave myself a way out. Discipline isn't about being harsh. It's about being loyal to the future version of yourself. It's about saying, "I care about you too much to let present me be lazy." That's what 6 p.m. became. A sacred contract between the me now and the me I was trying to become. One weekend, my best friend invited me to a party. I really wanted to go. I needed the break. I needed to laugh, to breathe, to feel like a normal teenager for once. But I looked at the clock, and it was 5:53 p.m. 7 minutes until I had to study. I sat there, torn, and I made a decision that still makes me proud today. I went to my desk. I studied from 6:00 to 8:00. Then I got on my bike, pedaled to the party, and joined them late. That night, I had fun. But I also went to sleep knowing I hadn't broken my promise to myself. And that was better than any party. You see, people think discipline is a punishment. It's not. Discipline is love. It's the love you show to your future. It's the love that says, "I won't abandon you for short-term pleasure." It's the quiet kind of love, the kind that doesn't post about itself, the kind that's not flashy, not loud, but it lasts. And that's what I was learning. Day by day, hour by hour, flashcard by flashcard. I was falling in love with becoming dependable. Months later, I sat for the final exam. I wasn't nervous, not because I thought I'd get a perfect score, but because I knew I'd done the work. Whatever happened next wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was just a reflection of that moment. But the journey, the decision to keep showing up at 6 p.m., that was mine, and no result could take that away from me. So if you're struggling now, if you're tired, if you feel behind or discouraged or lost, let me say this: you are allowed to feel all those things, but you are not allowed to quit on yourself. Make 6 p.m. sacred, or 7 o'clock, or 9 o'clock, or whatever time works for your life. Make an appointment with your dream, and don't miss it, no matter what. That's how you build a future. Not by being the smartest, not by being the fastest, but by being the most faithful. It was 6 p.m. again, the kind of 6 p.m. that shows up after a long, tiring day where nothing quite goes right. I remember that particular evening well, not because anything big happened, but because nothing did. And sometimes, those are the days when the smallest choices echo the loudest. My feet dragged against the floor as I walked toward the desk. My mind buzzed from a failed quiz that morning. I'd studied for hours the night before, pushed through exhaustion but somehow still came up short, and now I was expected to sit again, to try again, to open the same book filled with the same numbers that felt like they were laughing at me, and I did, because it was 6 p.m. you see. When I say I made time, I don't mean that I found an extra hour lying around like spare change in a couch cushion. I mean I built my day around that moment. Everything else came second. Social plans, later, entertainment, after, even rest. Only once that hour was honored. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was sacred, and slowly, that decision started to shape me. The hour that made me there's something powerful about doing what you said you'd do. It builds this strange kind of trust, not with others, but with yourself. It says, you can rely on you. And trust me, when you start believing that, the world looks different. While my classmates joked about how late they stayed up, how little they studied, how they'd cram later, I already had a date with discipline, and the results didn't show up immediately. I didn't suddenly become top of the class, but I did become someone I respected. There were nights when I stared at the same paragraph for 30 minutes, unable to understand it. Nights when my friends were out celebrating birthdays or laughing at someone's house party, and I was at home wrestling with the weight of formulas and fear. Nights when I looked out the window, wishing I was anywhere but where I was, and yet I stayed. And that changed me more than any score ever did, because while others were chasing moments, I was building momentum. The quiet war against later is a liar. It whispers, you deserve a break. It says, you'll feel more motivated tomorrow. But later never arrives like you hope it will. It's always dressed in excuses and disguised as kindness. But I learned to fight it. Every time I sat down at 6 p.m., I was at war with later, and the more I showed up, the quieter that voice became. People began to notice. Not right away, but slowly. A teacher pulled me aside one day after class and said, you've been improving. Keep it up. I nodded politely, but inside, I was beaming, not because I was praised, but because I realized that effort shows. Consistency leaves a trail. The 6 p.m. light. Sometimes, people think discipline is harsh, like it squeezes the life out of your joy. But I found the opposite. The more I committed to my hour, the more free I became. I didn't have to worry about deadlines creeping up. I didn't have to panic before exams. I didn't feel like I was always behind, because I had time. I made time. I created a real heartbeat for my dreams. It became the lens through which I viewed everything else. Opportunities weren't about talent anymore. They were about readiness. And because I kept showing up, I started being ready. I'd walk into a classroom already, knowing the answers, not because I was gifted, but because I'd done the work. Day after day, hour after hour, the sacred 6 o'clock. And even when I wasn't sure if it was working, even when the results didn't match the effort, trusted the process, because I knew one thing: nothing gets built without time. While the world was watching, something funny happens when you start becoming consistent. People noticed at first, they're confused, then they're curious, and eventually, they get inspired. One friend started messaging me, asking how I studied. Another started joining me at the library. Some just sat in silence next to me, laptops open, hoping a little discipline would rub off. I never judged them. I just shared the only thing I knew. Start at 6 o'clock. Whatever your 6 o'clock is, your hour, your space, your promise to yourself. Honor it. Because if you don't schedule your goals, life will schedule distractions. The loneliness of commitment. Let Be honest with you, it's lonely sometimes. When you're choosing to work while others play. When you say no to things that look fun, feel fun, are fun, just because you know your future depends on it. There were nights I sat with a heavy chest, wondering if I was missing out on life. Nights when I felt like the only one rowing a boat that wasn't even moving. But here's what I learned. Every no to distraction was a yes to something deeper. A yes to growth, a yes to peace, a yes to the version of myself I hadn't met yet, but desperately wanted to. And the more I showed up, the more I realized I wasn't behind. I was ahead in a race most people didn't even know they were running. The mirror never lies. You can't fake effort, not to yourself. You know when you gave your all, and you know when you did and single quotes. There were days when I sat down at 6 p.m. and barely got through a page, but I showed up. And showing up is half the battle. I remember one night, my eyes burning from fatigue, thinking, is this worth it? I looked in the mirror and saw a tired face, unremarkable, unexceptional, but I also saw someone fighting, someone refusing to quit, and that mattered, because it wasn't about the grades anymore. It wasn't about outshining anyone. It was about keeping a promise. The turning point, I don't know the exact moment things turned. Maybe it was when I started finishing assignments early. Maybe it was when I stopped second-guessing myself before tests. Maybe it was the first time someone asked me for help instead of the other way around. But I do know this, it didn't happen suddenly. It happened slowly, daily, relentlessly. At 6 p.m. because I had time. People often say, I wish I had more time, but you do. You just have to decide what's worthy of it. That's what I did. I took 1 hour a day and turned it into a lifetime of possibilities. And I'll say it again, not because it sounds good, but because it's true. Success isn't about being fast, it's about not stopping. So if you feel behind, if you feel slow, if you feel like the mountain is too high, remember this, you have time, make it sacred, and begin, again and again, at 6 p.m. And here's the truth, I wasn't the smartest in the room. A story about persistence, patience, and the power of showing up. Part 6, let me tell you about the year everything changed. Not because life suddenly got easier, but because I decided I would no longer wait for life to get easier. That year, I didn't suddenly become smarter. I didn't wake up with some divine revelation. No angel whispered formulas in my ear. No fairy godmother handed me a better brain. What I had was a clock, and a chair, and a choice. Every single day at 6 p.m. I made that choice again. The world doesn't reward talent as much as it rewards consistency. And that's something they don't teach you in school. They'll test your memory. They'll test your speed. But they won't test how many nights you quietly sat down and worked when no one asked you to. I remember one evening during it was raining hard. The kind of rain that makes you want to crawl under a blanket and pretend tomorrow doesn't exist. And I had a pile of math problems that made zero sense to me. Do you know what I did? I made tea. I sat down. I opened the book, and I stared at the first problem until my brain hurt. And then, I solved it. Not on the first try, not on the second, maybe on the seventh, but I got it, and that one problem felt like a mountain conquered. Meanwhile, my friends were out, some at the movies, some at parties, some just scrolling, refreshing their feed, watching the minutes dissolve. And I was here at my desk with my wet hoodie, steaming mug, and a tiny, personal victory no one would ever clap for. But I clapped, for myself, silently, with pride, because I knew what they didn't. This was going to matter, maybe not tonight, but someday. Here's a brutal truth that changed my life. No one is coming to save you. Not your teachers, not your parents, not your friends, not the future version of yourself you keep imagining. Only you, now, doing the hard thing, again and again and again. And here's the good news. You don't have to do it all at once. You just have to sit down. At 6 o'clock, or whatever time you make sacred, you show up. You open the book. You begin. And then you do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. One day, I got a message from an old classmate. He wrote, I don't know how you do it. I always thought you weren't that bright in school, but you just kept showing up. And I smiled, because he was right. I wasn't that bright. I was slow. I had to read things 3 times just to understand them once. I fumbled through logic puzzles that others solved in seconds, but I didn't stop. That was the difference. That's always the difference. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to be flawless. You just have to be faithful. to the work, to your time, to your dream. People think progress looks like a rocket ship. It doesn't. It looks like a graph with a million zigzags. Some days are dips, some days are plateaus, and a few days, just a few, are leaps. But every day is a dot, and your job is to keep showing up and putting that dot on the graph. I remember nights when my motivation was at zero, not low, zero, but discipline whispered, "It's 6 o'clock," and I obeyed, because I knew if I waited for motivation, I'd be waiting forever. Want to know a secret? The pain of discipline is far lighter than the pain of regret. I'd rather sit through one more night of frustration now than wonder later why I gave up. That's what kept me going, not glory, not praise, just the belief that someday this will matter, and it did, eventually. I didn't need 6 p.m. to tell me what to do. It became who I was. I wasn't the smartest, but I was the most stubborn, and sometimes that's enough. They say it takes 10,000 hours to master something. I didn't count the hours, I counted the choices. Each time I chose to sit down, that was a vote for my future. Each time I resisted the urge to scroll, to delay, to avoid, that was me writing my story. And now, you're hearing it, not because I was special, but because I stayed. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this. Success isn't a moment. It's not a trophy. It's not a score on a test. It's a pattern, a ritual, a promise you make to yourself and keep in silence. It's you, at 6 p.m., doing the work whether the world watches or not, because that's how you become who you're meant to be. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound. It comes from inside you. The kind of silence you meet at 2 a.m. when everyone else is asleep and you're still awake, staring at the same sentence, the same problem, the same dream, still unsolved. By this point, I was well into my habit. 6 p.m. was mine. Mine to wrestle with confusion. Mine to fight the slow progress. Mine to sit down and do the work. Again and again and again. But let me tell you something no one ever tells you loud enough. Persistence is not always glamorous. Most of the time, it's invisible. People notice when you win. They'll clap when you stand on the stage, or when your name gets called, or when your work finally shows up somewhere that matters. But the days you cried at your desk, no one claps for that dot. The moments you erased your notes for the 5th time. The nights you paced the room wondering if you were just fooling yourself. Those don't make headlines. They don't get likes. They just get lived. And in those moments, you have to clap for yourself. You have to remember why you started. You have to remind yourself that you didn't come this far to only come this far. I remember a stretch of 3 weeks where everything just broke. Not literally, but it felt like it. My brain stopped working. Or at least, that's how I told myself. The material made no sense. The concepts were blurry. The formulas twisted. The logic felt upside down. I couldn't follow the sentences in the textbooks anymore. And worse, I started questioning everything. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I was just pretending all along. Maybe the world is right to move on without me. That's what failure sounds like. Inside your own mind. Not some dramatic collapse. Just a quiet eroding of belief. But I did something in those 3 weeks I'm still proud of. I showed up. That I didn't improve. I didn't impress anyone. But I showed up. I sat there at 6 p.m., opened the book, turned the pages, read the same paragraph 5 times. Sometimes I'd whisper it out loud just to hear myself try. Sometimes I'd close the book mid-session and take a walk just to stop my mind from spiraling. But I came back. Every time I came back. And that's where real change happens. See, motivation gets you started, but it's commitment that keeps you going. Commitment isn't loud. It's not flashy. It doesn't care if you're in the mood. It just shows up, like a friend who never lets you down. And slowly, I started learning again. Not faster, not smarter, but deeper, but deeper. I began to understand not just the what, but the why. I stopped chasing shortcuts and started building systems. Daily checklists, weekly reviews, flashcards on sticky notes, voice memos to myself explaining complex concepts in simple terms. I turned my struggle into structure. And you know what's wild? That structure began to carry me, like a bridge over all the confusion. One night, I was sitting at my desk. It was almost midnight. I had finished my 6 p.m. session hours earlier, but something wouldn't let me go. A problem I hadn't been able to solve for weeks suddenly clicked. Like a light bulb turning on in a room you forgot had a switch. I remember just staring at the solution, I read it 3 times. I double-checked every step, and then I cried, not because of the answer, but because I didn't give up before it came. That's what most people miss. It's not about being smart. It's about lasting longer than the problem. It's about out the silence, out-loving the frustration, because some victories only come to those who refuse to quit. Let me tell you a story. There was a girl in one of my classes. She was brilliant, sharp, quick-witted. She'd solve problems before I even understood them, and for a while, I let that intimidate me. I'd compare myself constantly. Why does she get it faster? Why does she never look tired? Then one day, we got paired up for a group project, and as we sat down to divide the work, she said something that shook me. "You're one of the most disciplined people I know," she said. I laughed. "Me? I'm the one always behind." She shook her head. "No, you never miss. You never complain. You keep showing up even when it's hard." I admire that. It was the first time I realized that the world might be watching me, too. Not for my speed, but for my stamina. And isn't that what life really is? A long race, not a sprint. Everyone's pace is different. Everyone's obstacles are different. But consistency, that's the great equalizer. It turns ordinary into exceptional, effort into excellence, confusion into clarity. Bit by bit, brick by brick, you build something unbreakable, not because you were born with it, but because you stayed with it. I started keeping a journal around that time, not for pretty quotes or aesthetic pages, just raw, messy thoughts, wins, losses, reflections after every 6 p.m. session. Some days, all I could write was, "Still confused, still here." Other days, "I made progress today." And every now and then, "I can't believe I understand this now." Those pages became proof that I was doing the work, even when it didn't show on the outside. It's easy to forget how far you've come when you're still in the tunnel. That journal reminded me I was moving, even if it felt like crawling. I want to say this to you. If you're still with me, you don't need to be the fastest. You don't need to be the best. You just need to be there. When the rest of the world chooses later, you choose now. When they scroll, you study. When they doubt, you deliver. When they quit, you stay. And slowly, you become someone they never saw coming. Let me take you to a quiet moment again. Not the start, not the end, just the middle. The place where most dreams go to die. See, nobody really talks about the middle. We talk a lot about the beginning, how exciting it is to start something new, full of motivation and fresh plans. And we love talking about the finish line, the moment of victory, the standing ovation, the YouTube montage with dramatic music in the background. But the middle, that's the dark stretch. That's where it gets lonely. That's where no one's clapping. That's where the silence is louder than your thoughts. It was around this point that I felt like quitting. Not once, not twice. Almost every single day. I had been sitting at my desk for weeks, maybe months, following the schedule religiously. Every 6 p.m., I showed up. I opened the book. I tried, I studied. And yet, my grades didn't seem to move. My progress was invisible. My motivation, worn thin. I looked around at my friends, and they were living. They were out at cafes, watching movies, playing games, and posting pictures of smiles that made me wonder if I was missing out. And there I was, in my little room, sitting at a desk full of notes and highlighters, surrounded by silence and pages. I still didn't fully understand. There was this one evening I remember clearly. The sun had set. The room was dim, lit only by the small desk lamp that hummed softly. I had just finished a mock test. Score, 38%. I remember just staring at that number. It mocked me. After all that effort, still below passing, my chest tightened. My throat felt like it was closing in. I slumped into the chair, arms hanging loose, and for the first time, I muttered, "What's the point?" No one heard me. No one needed to. That question didn't need an answer from the world. It was a whisper to myself, and the dangerous thing about whispers is they can echo. What's the point? Maybe I'm just not cut out for this. I'm too slow. I'll never catch up. Other people are just smarter. That night, I didn't even open my book at 6 o'clock. I just sat there, letting the fear flood in, letting the doubt take over, letting the stillness win. And you know what? It felt easier than fighting. It felt easier than trying. It felt easier than hope. But here's what saved me: not motivation, not inspiration, not some sudden lightning bolt of courage. It was a little post-it note, stuck to the bottom corner of my whiteboard. I had written it months ago, and I'd forgotten it was there. It said, Discipline is doing it, especially when it makes no sense to keep going. I read it once, then again, and something inside me whispered, not loud, not brave, not confident, just a quiet voice. Just do the next thing. I pulled my chair up, opened the book, did one question, then another, then another. It wasn't pretty. I didn't feel smart, but I moved. That's what the middle asks of you. Not excellence, not brilliance, just movement. Because in the middle, success looks like survival, and survival looks like doing. One more page, one more paragraph, one more hour. It's not about how fast you go, it's that you don't stop. And slowly, ever so slowly, you realize something. You've become the kind of person who doesn't give up, the kind of person who shows up anyway, the kind of person who's becoming unbreakable. Not because you always win, but because you don't run. In that lonely middle, I became someone else. Not the smartest, not the fastest, but the most consistent. And that was the turning point. The world didn't notice yet. My test scores didn't spike overnight. No one gave me a trophy, but I gave myself something more powerful: proof that I could keep going, proof that I could feel lost and still walk forward, proof that the hardest moments wouldn't define me, they'd refine me. And from that point on, 6 p.m. wasn't a burden, it was a reminder. You've come too far to quit now. So if you're in the middle, if you're in that dark, lonely stretch where nothing makes sense and everyone else seems further ahead, don't stop. Don't look sideways. Don't wait for the noise of motivation. Just move. One more step, one more hour, one more try. Because the middle, that's where you become unstoppable. And one day, you'll look back at this stretch, this silence, this struggle and realize this was where you became who you were meant to be.
There's this quiet shift that happens, so subtle you almost miss it. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. There's no drum roll, no confetti from the ceiling, no grand applause. It just happens. At first, it's a single question you get right that you used to always get wrong. Then it's a paragraph that makes sense without you reading it 3 times. Then it's your pen moving a little faster, your notes getting a little neater. Then it's the moment you notice the clock hits 6 p.m. and you're already there, already sitting, already starting without the internal battle. The middle is brutal, but if you stay long enough, something incredible begins to take shape. A pivot, a quiet turn. And like a ship slowly shifting its direction after endless rowing in darkness, you begin to feel the change. Let me tell you about my pivot. It didn't come with a celebration. It came with a mock test. Yeah, another one of those tests that had haunted me for months. But this time, I approached it differently. Not with fear, not with expectation, but with presence. I had spent the last few weeks showing up, night after night, with no signs of massive improvement. But this time, I didn't carry the weight of needing to prove myself. I just opened the test and gave it what I had. 2 hours passed. I submitted it, walked away, didn't obsess over it. Didn't refresh the page every 5 minutes waiting for a score. I went and made tea, took a walk, breathed, and when the result came back, 72%. 72. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't groundbreaking, but it was enough to crack something open in me. It was the first time I looked at a number and felt proud. Not because it was high, but because it reflected a process, a journey, a fight I hadn't abandoned. And that night, for the first time, I didn't cry. I smiled. Here's the thing most people don't understand. Success doesn't come like a lightning bolt. It comes like dawn. You don't notice the exact moment the darkness ends. But one day you look up and there's light on the horizon. That's the pivot. When the struggle stops being your identity and becomes your fuel. Now, you might think the story gets easier from here. But let me be honest, it doesn't. What changes isn't the workload. It's you. You stop fearing the work. You stop dreading the page. You stop seeing your dream as this unreachable mountain. And you start seeing it as a path, one you've already been walking for miles. There's power in that, a quiet, steady confidence. Not arrogance, just a knowing, a deep inner belief. I've made it this far. I'll make it further. The funny thing is, people around you begin to notice. They don't always say it, but you feel it. Your friends stop asking if you're still doing that thing and start saying, wow, you've really stuck with it. You start getting those nods of respect, not because you're flashy, but because consistency is magnetic. You don't have to shout. You become the message. And then comes a beautiful season, momentum, Oh, momentum is a gift. After months, sometimes years of pushing a boulder uphill, you feel it roll with you for the first time. It doesn't mean you stop working, but it means your energy changes. You no longer have to wrestle yourself into the chair every night. You show up because it's who you are now. The schedule isn't a cage, it's a compass. The discipline isn't punishment, it's your power. And suddenly, hours fly by, where once you stared at pages, now you tear through them. Where once you doubted yourself, now you back yourself. You walk taller, you sleep better, you trust your own mind again. Not because it never fails, but because you know you'll recover. Let me pause here and tell you this. If you're in the middle or barely past it, waiting for the pivot, don't try to force it. Just keep showing up. The pivot doesn't come when you expect it. It comes because you stayed when it made no sense to. It comes because you chose the page instead of Netflix, the walk instead of the scroll, the growth instead of the comfort. And when it comes, it's worth every tear, every doubt, every lonely night. I remember one night, weeks after my 72%. I was sitting with a new mock test, different topic, harder content, but I wasn't scared. In fact, I was almost excited. That surprised me because a few months before, this same test would have triggered panic, dread, a spiral of anxiety. But now, I saw it as a challenge, not a threat, a chance to see how far I'd come. And that, my friend, is one of the most powerful feelings in the world. Not achieving the goal, but realizing you're no longer who you used to be. Let's talk about that. Because sometimes the real reward of this journey isn't the dream itself. It's the person you become along the way. The one who learns to sit in discomfort, shows up when no one's watching, chooses growth even when it hurts, faces fear and still moves forward. You don't get those qualities from wishing. You earn them through repetition, through resistance, through resilience. And once you have them, no one can take them from you. Not a bad grade, not a failed attempt, not a harsh comment, because your identity is no longer built on outcome. It's built on effort, and that makes you bulletproof. Let me end this part with something important. Even after the pivot, you'll have bad days. You'll mess up. You'll lose focus. You'll oversleep. You'll bomb a test. You'll feel the whisper of quitting again. But now you'll have something you didn't before. Evidence. Proof that you've done hard things before. Proof that you've come back before. Proof that the middle didn't kill you. It built you. So when the voice of doubt returns, you don't panic. You breathe. You rest. You reset. And then you begin again. Because once you've survived the middle and felt the pivot, you know this truth. You're not doing this just to reach a goal. You're doing this to become someone you're proud of, someone you trust, someone who doesn't quit. And that, my friend, is the greatest pivot of all. Let me tell you what happens after you keep showing up. Not just once, not just when it's convenient, but every day. When your body's tired, when your mind screams for a break, when nobody is watching, when everyone else is resting, scrolling, doubting, or quitting. This is what happens. One day, you look up and you realize you've become the person you thought you'd never be. Not because you were born that way, not because you were lucky, not because you suddenly got smarter, but because you refused to leave the table. I remember the first time I got a perfect score. It was a quiet afternoon. There were no fireworks, no audience, no one waiting with a camera to catch my smile. Just me, my desk, and that sheet of paper. My name at the top, 100% at the bottom. I stared at it for a long time, not in disbelief, but in quiet understanding. Because that grade, that moment, wasn't the result of one night studying. It wasn't a fluke. It was the result of every single 6 p.m. I had guarded like a treasure. It was every page I reread 3 times because I didn't get it the first 2. It was every problem I tried and failed and tried again. It was every moment I wanted to say, I'll do it later, but chose, let's go instead. I took a photo of that paper, not to brag, not to post, but to remember, to remind myself that discipline had brought me here, that I had built this moment with my own hands. You see, there's a kind of pride that isn't loud. It's not boastful. It doesn't need validation. It's the kind of pride that sits with you in silence and says, you kept your promise. And maybe that's the most sacred feeling there is. I went on to graduate, top 10%, not top of the class, but nowhere near the bottom where I started. I got accepted into a program I once thought was out of reach. I got offers I never thought I'd deserve. People started asking me for advice, the same people who used to look past me. Funny, isn't it? How slowly success builds, how quietly it arrives. But when it comes, it's undeniable because it's earned. There's something I've realized now that I'm a little older. Most people want to arrive, but very few want to walk. Most people chase comfort. They crave motivation, inspiration, convenience. They wait for the right moment, the perfect mood, the right alignment of stars. But let me say this clearly. Success doesn't wait for those things. Success belongs to the one who shows up, even when nothing feels right. The truth is, I'm still not the smartest in the room. That hasn't changed. But now, I'm not intimidated by that anymore. Because I know something deeper. I know how to stay. I know how to endure. I know how to outlast. And sometimes that's more powerful than talent. Because talent can get tired. Genius can give up. But grit stays. People ask me, what's your secret? And I tell them something they rarely expect. I made 6 p.m. sacred. Not because I was a genius. Not because I was obsessed. But because I knew no one was going to build this life for me. Because I realized my goals weren't going to walk themselves into existence. Because I knew I couldn't afford to wait for motivation to visit me like some guest. So I made the table. I sat down. I did the work. Looking back, I can't remember every page I read, every mistake I made, or every night I pushed through. But I remember the decision. That choice to begin. That choice to not stop. That choice to believe that slow progress was still progress. And that decision has echoed through my life ever since. Because once you know you're capable of showing up consistently, once you've seen yourself endure, no goal feels impossible anymore. You know you're not made of luck. You're made of effort. And there's nothing more powerful than that. Now it's your turn. Maybe you feel like I once did. Not the smartest, not the fastest, not the one others believe in. But let me tell you something raw and real. You don't need to be extraordinary to begin. You just need to begin and not stop. Set the time. Honor it like a promise. Guard it like a life. Because that time is how you carve your name into possibility. Not with brilliance, but with repetition. The world won't hand you your dream, but it will yield, slowly, stubbornly, eventually, to the one who never left the table. So if this story feels like yours, if you've been doubting, hesitating, waiting for the right moment, let this be your sign. It's 6 p.m. Let's go.